Everyone, what's going on? It is I don't even know what day it is. Monday afternoon, sitting up in my guest bedroom, which has become the makeshift office for me since COVID, and just wanted to take a chance just to kind of share a few things I've been learning here recently, and more than anything, just drive home a few points. As you know, I talk about anxiety quite a bit. Written about it. It's a topic I get asked to speak on probably more than anything. It's probably why the majority of people who see me in therapy probably come typically because they're working through some type of anxiety issue. And we're just seeing a huge, anxiety was already on the rise in our culture for a long time. And it seems like looking at the data and research and just like anecdotal personal experience stuff that it's going to continue to be on the rise. It's going to kind of be like a boomerang effect coming out of COVID. And, if one's consuming the news every day and just going to the gas pump and grocery store and stuff, there's a lot of mass shootings, lots of reasons to have some high anxiety. So it's pretty normal. And, probably trying to think of the date, about a month ago, we launched our first kind of pilot anxiety intensive. Me and two other therapists, actually, a couple of researchers, and we brought in 7 people to run this pilot intensive with a 4-day intensive. And we're doing another one here in about, I don't know, about 2 months. And we'll kind of see how these go. And based on those pilots, we're going to start training some therapists and launch into some other avenues with some people and hopefully help people um, encounter some ways to work through their anxiety in an intensive setting and hopefully get some things published coming out of this. And I'll share all that later. But all that to say, anxiety is always on my mind. It's something, as a lot of you know, I've struggled with a lot of my life, and it's just something that I write about and talk about and see in my work, whether it's work with therapists, like colleagues talking about things going on, whether it's working with clients in a therapy setting, whether it's working with business people in an executive coaching setting. Like anxiety is always, it's just there. And I just want to focus on one point today because I want to keep this kind of short, which I know can be hard for me to do sometimes. But just one kind of like just thing for you to hold on to and to practice. And I'm going to kind of back up a second and tell you some context and been thinking about a lot because I told you all that I read a book. I mentioned it on Instagram and other places too. So maybe I didn't tell all of you yet, but I read a book by Michael Easter called The Crisis Comfort. Great book, really loved it. And there's just a lot of overlap, I think, in there in terms of the work with anxiety. And one of the things that he talks about in his book is essentially this idea of getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. And he kind of couches it, if I can say this, in terms of like what he calls progressive overload. So for those of you who work out or lift weights, you get stronger by overloading the weights, like your body, right? You increase the amount of weight you attempt to lift, and so over time your body gets stronger with the weight. You get bigger, get more muscular. So you overload that. If you don't stress your body, you never grow strong, right? And I think that just has so many implications for anxiety. And essentially, if we don't face our anxiety and test it, we can never, I say never, really grow strong through it. We never learn how to be comfortable with it. We never, I think, learn how to I want to say minimize it, where it doesn't seem like that big of a deal. We don't learn how to, I think, face it and heal it and work through it. So just that idea of like, when it comes to anxiety, how do we slowly, maybe it's slowly for some, maybe it's rapidly for others, progressively overload our systems with bits and bits of anxiety that we can learn to encounter so that it doesn't become so difficult, it doesn't become so painful. And a lot of this, I won't go into huge detail because again, I've written about it, I've told you about it, but a lot of this just goes back to, I think I first discovered this in my own experience working through my anxiety as a kid, as an adolescent, as a young adult, and then writing about it in the book, The Anxious Christian, back in about, man, it's been 2012, I guess, since that was published. Um, but there's a story in there about one of my main points of anxiety is that I was a stutterer. I couldn't talk, couldn't speak, and the roots of that were the traumatizing death of my mom to breast cancer when I was 11, and all the anxiety that had built up over the years since she was diagnosed when I was 6. So I go back to school 2 weeks later after she passes away, and I can't talk. The teacher calls me to read, and I cannot literally read. And so I remember just struggling through the years. And one of the things that I just kind of, I don't know why I decided this as faith. I think it was just insight from God to help me along, because I never saw a therapist or anything. Was I knew that to overcome my stuttering and my anxiety there, I needed to be able to speak. And so I remember just, again, praying for opportunities to speak, and some amazing opportunities all of a sudden came months, not even months, probably a month or two after I prayed that prayer. And it was a big one. It was in front of a huge group of people. It was the Easter morning sunrise service on my college campus at the time, pretty small college campus, Grand Canyon University, which is a really big school now. And remember speaking in front of, I don't know how many people that day, a couple of hundred, and just stuttering my way through that talk, through that sermon. And that was a huge jump from knowing I'm in this anxiety and this fear, and I gotta face, I have to overload my system. I gotta encounter it to try to practice my way working through it. And it's not always that drastic for people, but for me, that was like the moment that I'm like, okay, life can be different. So I thought, let me give you a few examples, and let me tell you why this is important. It's important because I think a lot of people have a lot of insight into their life. A lot of you understand maybe why you're anxious. Some of you may understand the roots of it. I still think a lot of people don't really understand the roots. They'll just describe themselves as anxious people. They may have a story or two, but I think deep down, they may not have the language to understand what drives their anxiety. So there's some insight for a lot of you, and others of you have more insight about what this anxiety entails in your life. But insight alone is not enough. You can't just have knowledge about your anxiety, right? You can't just know about it and learn about it. You have to actually do something with it. And so this idea of like practice, and I always say that insight plus practice equals transformation, or equals change. That when you take what you know, the knowledge you know about your anxiety, and you put it into practice, that's when people start to change. That's when they grow. That's when they get healing around their anxiety. That's when they get maybe comfortable with the level of anxiety. That's when they learn how to live in moments of anxiety, and be with it, sit with it. But you can't just have insight, right, and have knowledge and not practice it. And you can't just like not have any insight or knowledge about anxiety and just try and go do things different necessarily. There has to be a wedding, like a marriage of the two things. And so just kind of like thinking about that, I took a few notes. I'm going to probably look at them here, for example. But so let me throw out a few examples, and they may resonate with you, they may not. Let's say there's a kid in school who's struggling with anxiety, and it manifests itself mainly in the fear of like public speaking. That's scary. I relate to that, and I wouldn't throw that kid out in front of a stage at all. That's one of my. It's not a regret, but one of the things that I really wish was different about my experience, like in grade school and high school, for example, was that somebody knew what was going on with me and could diagnose it, because I got thrown up in a lot of situations that I think just exacerbated it and made it worse, like created some actual like panic for me. And I have a couple stories around that, that I won't share, but that feeling. But if I'm working with someone, and these are true stories, but let's say a kid who's struggling with anxiety with like social circumstances, and the kid walks around the hallways with headphones on and kind of isolates himself from classmates, and that anxiety grows because the more he disengages or she disengages, the harder it is to approach people. And so we might start simple. I might ask that person to, next time you walk down the hall, just walk down the hall without any earphones on. You don't have to talk to anybody, just see what that's like. Just test it out, and let's talk about it. Come back with some new insight, and then I'll give you something else to practice, right? Or let's say somebody is anxious about taking on I don't know, they want to get out of a job, but they're fearful of being a failure. So they get paralyzed by taking on new things, right? They don't want to fail. So they stay in their comfort zone and never try new things. So what we might do is identify, what are some of those things that you aren't doing in your life out of fear of failure. And let's just slowly practice doing like a small one, And so let's say somebody wants to take on a job transition. I may not, throw them to the wolves and say, go try this new job, but we might start with over the period of a couple of months, hey, why don't you try this new hobby by yourself that exposes you to some unknowns and increases some anxiety, but it gives you opportunity to practice calming your anxiety and working through it and maybe pick up some skills that we can then translate later on into a job transition for you. Or, like maybe there's somebody, I'm trying to think of some other good examples. The kid who is a perfectionist and afraid of failure, so they get paralyzed in that fear of failure, and stuff doesn't get done, or stuff gets done, but it gets done, it takes so much time that they're exhausted. So I might encourage them to go out and actually just practice failing that exam or that test, or doing something that exposes them to the failure and makes them realize it's not the end of the world. Now that sounds drastic, I don't want anyone to fail something. So we might find opportunities to fail. I share a story, how my therapist, because I had this kind of deep fear of like, I think life being out of control for me, tied to my mom's death and other things that are happening in my life. And so when I'm in, my early 30s, I was kind of controlling in the sense of I would get some OCD behaviors, and things had to be kind of perfect in certain aspects of my life or my house, for example. And one of those things was that I needed things to be orderly. And if they got out of order, I would get some anxiety around it. And I remember the therapist again coaching me and talking to me about some ways maybe to work through that. And I remember telling him a story. I don't know how it came up, but he knew that we had people over to our house for dinner a lot. And I talked about how when dinner was going on, I'd pick up the dishes and I'd be back in the kitchen cleaning. And he said, right, you're not present. Your anxiety is so high, you're not present. You're thinking about how to manage it and control it. And there you are in the back of the kitchen washing dishes while your friends are having this party, and you're not there, you're not present. So he's like, next time people come to your house, I want you to let the dishes sit in the table, right? And just engage and just notice your anxiety, just sit with it, get comfortable. It's kind of that progressive overload idea. And then after people go home, take the dishes to the kitchen and leave them in the sink overnight. And I was like, whoa, that's way too much. But I did it. And his point was proven. It wasn't the end of the world. I learned to get a little bit more comfortable with anxiety. And so I started testing it out in other areas. I started letting other little things in my life go. I might notice something simple, like a book on a shelf that was fallen over. And normally I'd go pick it and fix it. And it doesn't seem like a big deal, but I let the book sit there. And I just sit with that little anxiety. I've talked to people over the years of just letting, for example, some clothes sit on the floor and not feeling like they have to rush to pick them up, or letting the kitchen sit a little dirty, or letting your kids' toys sit out a little longer. And so you're learning to get comfortable to kind of overload your system in terms of things that make you anxious. And so I think this is just an important thing. And so you have insight, why am I anxious? What's are the roots of my anxiety? And sometimes there's some things that people are pretty identifiable about. I'm anxious about dogs because I got bit when I was a young kid. And so when I see a dog, I get anxious, right? Or I get anxious talking to people in a public setting because I had this experience at one time. And so I have this like phobia around speaking around people in a public setting. Or, I grew up in a home where mom and dad were all about straight A's. And if I got a B, they're like, why didn't you get a straight A there? And so I have this fear about failing, and it paralyzes me. So sometimes we can recognize them. And then sometimes there's deeper of what I would call existential threats. Like we can't really identify them. They're around the big things, around life and death, and they're hard to know. I know for me, I think a couple of really great therapists helped me really identify it early on, meaning in my late 30s. But for me, most of my anxiety is centered around a fear of failure and not being adequate, right? And so I get anxious or paralyzed around things where if I have to attempt them or do them, I may come across like short, like not measuring up. And this is one of the reasons that I didn't intentionally do this, but I noticed at some point in my running, after the marathon, after the 50K, that I wanted to take on longer runs, but there was a fear of failure because I had never gone that distance before. And I didn't want to come up inadequate or not good enough. But I also kind of thought that was a way to work through my anxiety in a kind of offhand way. Me actually running and taking on the 50 miler and the 100K and the 100 miler and taking on my biggest challenge coming up this fall or this late summer at UTMB is one way that I kind of work through my anxiety in life. I take on challenges where, I work hard for them and I train and I do what's within my control. But at the end of the day, there's unknowns. I might come up short. I might fail. I might not succeed. And I just feel like that's so important in my life because it translates into other areas like my work and my relationships, and as I've done that, I've put myself too in some work situations where I've tried some new things, though there might be a fear of failure, and so for me, there's kind of this deep existential thing of that. I was, thinking about a person I worked with who was just kind of a fear of death, like just their own sense of life and I'm going to die one day. There's a sense of mortality, I guess is the word I would use. And they just avoided situations that might remind them of their death, And so I encourage them to be around death a little more and to expose themselves, by starting by, maybe stuff in the news. And then, I said, maybe you could go work in a home where people, are on their last stages of life or some kind of hospice. You don't have to work, you can volunteer there, but be exposed to things that are at the root of your fear and kind of overload that, become more comfortable with that. And as that person did that and they started reading some things, um, the Stoics talk a lot about like just acknowledging that you may die today, just come to face with your death daily. I think the Bible in a lot of ways does the same thing. I think when Jesus in the story, if some of you are familiar with it, and the prayer, give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our sins, forgive others, and lead us not in temptation. That prayer, everything is centered on the day, being reminded of the day, that all we have is today. And sometimes I think we live in a culture where we don't really face our own sense of death or dying or mortality, a sense of, I can't say that word, mortality. So as this person exposed himself more, they realized what was at the root of their fear, and were able to get more comfortable with it and to work through that anxiety. And I think ultimately to be more present in their life. They were so wrapped up in the fear of dying, they weren't even present to the life that they had. So there's so many ways we could work at this. But the key is we want to take the insight about your anxiety, what's at the root of it, what's driving it. If we don't know what's the root of it, sure, you can manage it all day and treat it all day, but you can never get to the healing, right? And lots of people are fine with that. They're fine with just managing it. They want to maybe, and nothing wrong with this. I recommend people to take medication at some point if it's helpful to them, right? But some people are like, I'm fine just taking medication. I don't really want to deal with my anxiety. I want it managed. And some people don't want to get to the roots of it. I think to get deep healing, though, you have to get to the insight part. You have to know what is actually driving it. And you have to deal with it at a really, really deep level. And once you have that insight, it's like, let's take that fear, for example, of failure, and let's put it into practice. And it could be as simple as reminding yourself that you have this fear of failure and trying new things and practicing meditating, for example, on this idea of I'm not going to fail, or I'm not a failure. And for a lot of people, that sounds like super cheesy. You're telling me just to like repeat these phrases or mantras. But I think what's happening is they're missing actually what the brain does. And if you look at a lot of the work, especially I think the exciting work that that's happening in science now, when they can scan the brain and the fMRI scans, is that, we know that what we start to like think about, right, and meditate on over time becomes our beliefs, become really like cemented in there, and our beliefs then become our actions. We like literally think our way into a new way of living and operating. That's why I think, people, and I've written about this, I'm not going to get too far into it, but people are so easy to camp on Philippians 4:6, don't be anxious, but they miss all the good stuff in the couple of verses after. about where Paul's like, if you're anxious, well, then let's do these things, pray about these things, meditate on these things, and focus on these things. And there's this transformation, this renewing of your mind. Paul knew, thousands of years ago, that when you're anxious, that's okay. But I want you to start thinking about these things and meditate on these things. And there'll be this transformation. And so when I'm working with people, I want them to have insight. We have to be able to name what's at the root of our anxiety. It has to have, the way to take power out of it is to name it. It's not this unknown, ambiguous thing. And then as we name it, one of the ways we start to practice through it, we overload ourselves in sense of putting ourselves in situations that may increase anxiety and get more comfortable with it. But we also have a tool and starting to name that anxiety, what's at the root of it, and to give it a new name, to practice believing a new truth. And that, I'm making it sound much more easy than it is. It's easy in theory, but it's hard in practice. And what I mean by that is we can have a lot of insight, but to do the daily consistent work of practicing a new way of thinking and believing and acting, it just takes work. And some people want to do the work and others don't. But I think there's a huge direct correlation in people's lives that I've seen, and I think the research is there too, and I can speak from my own experience, that when you take your insight about your anxiety and then you move into practice around your anxiety, your life changes, you get transformation. That story too about me doing the dishes thing, a lot of it was about a fear of like losing control, and I had to practice letting go of control of some things in my life in order to realize, oh, it's okay. Life's not gonna fall apart. I know right now, and I think it's great, there's a lot of like writings and discussions about the Stoic philosophers is really popular right now. And most of that, I think, has been led by the way of the work of Ryan Holiday. He's written a lot of great stuff. Obstacle is a way, ego is the enemy, stillness is the key, courage is calling. He's got a lot of books. What I first was introduced to him was his kind of daily Stoic reading over the course of a year. And I read through that. And I love it. And it also just reminds me of a lot of the teachings of ancient or, Christianity and some of the other religions, Eastern religions. And I guess my point is this stuff is not new, and what's popular, I think, with the Stoic philosophers a lot today, what sticks with people, resonates, is a lot of their practices were about getting comfortable with what's uncomfortable in life. If there's a fear of security and that you might, end up on the street or go through a dire time or a depression, like a financial depression, and you won't have your physical means, people might encourage you then to practice sleeping on the floor, for example, get comfortable taking cold showers, get comfortable eating, practice in fasting and doing some things, getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. And so I think what I found helpful in my own work is that a lot of these older practices, whether it's Christianity, Stoic practices, Eastern religion, that they're back. And not, I shouldn't say that, they're not back, but I think they become really popular and people are talking about them. And I say, great, we have more tools now. And what it makes us realize too is that nothing is new under the sun. People have been worrying about things and practicing these things for thousands of years. So let's not try to reinvent the wheel and try something fancy or something new. Let's just stick to what we know. And the longer I do therapy, I'm more convinced that we just need one or two tools in our toolbox to navigate and transform our anxiety. I think what happens is people try something, it doesn't work, and they look for the next shiny object. What's going to work? What's going to work? And they keep moving from one thing to the next, instead of saying, okay, all we need to work on is gaining insight about our anxiety and then taking that and putting it into practice. So, I was trying to think of a current situation for me, and I don't know if there's one that like shines. I think I always run a little bit high anxiety a little bit in my life. I think that's kind of in my makeup and my DNA, but I'm actually really comfortable with it. Soren Kierkegaard, my favorite philosopher, talks about anxiety being our greatest teacher. So if I'm not anxious, and I don't mean like a daily ongoing anxiety where I can't function, but if I go through seasons where I don't notice some anxiety, I feel like something's wrong. I've come to believe that anxiety is my body's way, my life's way, God's way to kind of getting my attention to say, hey, pay attention, pay attention. And if you pay attention to what's going on and why this anxiety, take that insight, we can move into some really amazing things in your life, some really beautiful ways. So yeah. All right. So here's what I'm just going to leave it with this. So I want you to spend some time, one, thinking about your anxiety and see if you can get to the roots of it. And, I might start with this question. What is your first memory of being anxious? When do you really remember it? Like anxiety, just that behavior. And when that happened, what was your sense of like, what was going on there? What were the roots of it? The other helpful thing to think about is see anxiety as a behavior. It's something we do rather than a feeling. So think about when you were young, perhaps a lot of times I think the best stories come in our teenage years. Think about that teenage story when you notice yourself moving into anxiety, you're behaving anxiously. What do you think triggered that? Can you name it? Was it you became anxious because you were fear of failing? Was it you're anxious because you were alone? You were anxious because you weren't good enough. You were anxious because you were unloved. Try to connect the dots there. And once you connect the dots, think about, hey, this anxiety that I have, how can I like start to take my knowledge of it and put it into practice in my daily life in a practical way? What's a belief even around it that I need to practice thinking about and meditating differently? We're just trying to bring all this stuff from your subconscious to conscious so you can name it, think about it. So if I'm someone who most of my life has struggled with fear of failure, I want to name that. And then I want to put a new name to it. I want to think about this idea that I'm not a failure, that I can achieve, that I can be successful, and start rewiring the brain, right? So you got insight, and you take that insight, put in practice, and you get transformation. And I think where the crisis comfort hit me overall is that whole process of getting insight about anxiety and putting it into practice involves getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. You have to expose yourself to some situations that are difficult and uncomfortable to work through it. And sometimes it just needs one moment to a breakthrough that can lead to some amazing things in your life. So I know it's a lot of information. I'm going to write more on this here. Hopefully in the next few months, we're going to do some more work around the anxiety intensives. We'll shoot some more video. Got some video coming out in a few months that I'm going to be shooting over at Pepperdine too. So, hopefully this is helpful to you. If you have any questions, always feel free to reach out via email too, which is just Rhett, RHETT at rhettsmith.com, or hit me up on Instagram or whatever. And anyways, appreciate taking the time and good luck on this journey with your anxiety. Let me know if you have any questions.